Hi everyone, Rick Russell here. Stand by for channel markers.
Japs transmitting! Japs transmitting! Captain, radar reports Japanese patrol boats range of 400 yards.
How many yards?
400 yards in closing, sir.
Admiral Halsey's ordering the cruisers to open fire!
Gotta sink these Jap boats before they give away our position. Go to general quarters!
Wait a minute. Did he order the cruisers to open fire? Where are Halsey's destroyers? We're interested in the Doolittle raid for a variety of reasons. At the same time, lately we've been discussing the Navy's introduction of high-pressure steam into the fleet in the 1930s. Turns out there's an interesting connection. Here's the background to the raid, so bear with me. The understandable desire to attack Japan itself as soon as possible for morale purposes was a scheme cooked up for Admiral Nimitz in Washington. Just know that in February 1942, only weeks after taking command of the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz shelved the idea of attacking Japan with carriers, because using carrier aircraft would require a, quote, suicidally close, unquote, approach to Japan, as Nimitz's biographer Ned Potter writes. In addition to the obvious tactical concerns, he was already down one carrier because Saratoga had been torpedoed in January and would be out of action until summer. Nonetheless, zealots in the Army Air Corps had bought into the idea of raiding Tokyo, and on March 19th, Admiral King's emissary, Navy Captain Donald Duncan, arrived at Pearl Harbor to lay the plan in front of Nimitz. Oh, and for the record, that same month, defending Australia had also become an American responsibility, meaning that it was an Admiral Nimitz responsibility. As we know, the plan was to launch 16 stripped-down Army B-25 twin-engine bombers from a carrier in a symbolic vengeance raid on Japan. After bombs away, they would land in China. Sending one of Nimitz's carriers with Army aircraft strapped to her flight deck meant sending a second carrier to protect the task force. My sense is that back in the day, at least in Navy circles, the less said about Doolittle and the raid on Tokyo, the better. I might be wrong, but there are several major and minor debits to consider when determining if the raid made sense. But back to the story. The B-25s were craned onto the flight deck of the new carrier Hornet on April 1st, 1942, at Alameda, California. The next day, Hornet sailed with cruisers Vincennes and Nashville, 4 destroyers, and a fast oiler. Admiral Halsey, who had the job of delivering the raiders to their launch point, left Pearl Harbor in Enterprise, escorted by 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers with a fast oiler on April 8th. The 2 groups met near Hawaii on April 13th. Halsey took command of the enlarged Task Force 16. He had 16 ships. The 2 carriers, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers, and 2 high-speed oilers. The Navy's established concept of a carrier raid called for the movement of a task force of a single carrier escorted by cruisers and destroyers and accompanied by a fleet oiler to a position just beyond the range of the enemy's land-based aircraft. At this point, the destroyers would refuel from the oiler, then the task force would leave the oiler behind and dash at high speed, 25 knots or greater, toward the target with a plan of attacking at dawn. Having completed the attack and recovered all aircraft, the task force would withdraw the way it came, meeting the oiler to refuel and returning to Pearl Harbor. These tactics weren't new, and Halsey followed Doctrine on his approach to Japan, with one glaring change. He would leave all 8 destroyers behind with the oilers. Enterprise, Hornet, and the 4 cruisers would make the high-speed run toward Japan without their scouts and anti-submarine screen. So what was happening? Famous naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison mentions Halsey leaving his destroyers behind without comment, as if doing so was entirely normal. Halsey had done the same thing in an earlier carrier raid, but it was not standard procedure. The problem was the destroyers themselves. All 8 had the new high-pressure steam systems. These could be economically managed in peacetime, but in wartime they burned fuel at alarming and unpredictable rates, significantly reducing their range. Their first problem highlighted the second, which was the scarcity of oilers capable of operating with carriers and refueling warships in any weather. The short legs of the destroyers, when combined with wartime necessity, meant the Navy needed newer, more capable, and faster oilers to operate with carriers, a situation that persisted until advanced bases and refueling stations were seized from 1943 onward. The oilers we had needed to be protected. In other words, in early 1942, while so far from Pearl Harbor, Halsey had no choice but to leave the destroyers behind with the oilers while half of the Pacific Fleet's carrier force and 4 cruisers dashed into the unlighted front yard of the enemy. Now we begin to understand Nimitz's concern about raiding Japan. In Task Force 16, what we know as Murphy's Law was about to catch up with Colonel Doolittle. On April 17th, the carriers and cruisers were refueled about 1,000 miles from Tokyo. They left the destroyers and oilers behind and made best speed toward the target. To give the raiders a chance to make China, the plan was to launch aircraft 500 miles from Japan on the late afternoon of the 18th. However, at 0210 that day, when some 700 miles from Japan, radar picked up 2 ships ahead. Nobody suspected the Japanese patrolled so far out, but they had been tipped off. At 0500, an SBD from Enterprise reported another vessel only 42 miles ahead. Those destroyers might have come in handy because it was believed that the task force had been spotted. If the destroyers had been there, they might have detected or overcome the pickets before a surprise was lost. Halsey might have avoided them altogether. Another vessel was visually spotted by Hornet at 0644. If there was any doubt previously, surprise was most certainly lost. Nashville sank the picket with gunfire. 150 miles short of the planned launch point, it was time for a do-or-die decision. Either launch the aircraft so Hornet and Enterprise could retire, or abort the mission. As we know, 668 miles from Japan, the Tokyo Raiders executed their difficult takeoffs in heavy seas and flew into history. Now Murphy's Law caught up with Admiral Nimitz. Back at Pearl Harbor, even while the raiders were streaming across the wavetops toward Tokyo, naval intelligence informed Nimitz of a major Japanese move on Port Moresby, on the southeastern coast of New Guinea. Only a short distance from Australia, in Japanese hands, it would threaten communications to that vital continent and hinder Allied strategy significantly. Rather than meeting the threat with all 4 of his Pacific Fleet carriers, Nimitz was left with Admiral Fletcher's Yorktown and Lexington. Nimitz suffered a major case of buyer's remorse. His best carrier admiral and most effective carrier were returning at high speed to Pearl Harbor from the Northwest Pacific, while the real danger lay in the South Pacific. On the 18th in Hawaii, Nimitz's command summary included this line, quote, "SINCPAC will probably be unable to send enough force to be sure," their emphasis, "of stopping the Jap offensive," unquote. Halsey returned to Hawaii on April 25th and left 5 days later with 2 carriers and 14 other vessels. As we know, they didn't arrive in time to help Fletcher in the Battle of the Coral Sea. In that battle, the first of 4 major carrier battles in 1942, Lexington was lost and Yorktown was heavily damaged, but the Japanese had called off their Port Moresby operation. As a postscript, in 1945, as the rivalry with the Army Air Forces and issue of defense unification heated up, now General James Doolittle said, "I do feel strongly that it was not sea power that compelled Japan to sue for peace, and that it was not carrier strength that won the war." The Navy's next big fight would be in Washington. That's all for this channel marker. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment or recommend another subject below. As always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.